What is meant by the principle of separability of substance? The principle or principium of separability of substance is mentioned here at the beginning of the second paragraph. It says, the belief may be formalized into a special principium of separability of substance, that the existence of a substantial object as opposed to a quality or attribute means that it can be separated from other objects to go on its own isolated existential fate. So we find that what this is talking about is the existence of substantial objects as opposed to qualities or attributes means that it can be separated from other objects and go about its own isolated existential fate. Let's look at the options. Option A says, the world exists on the assumption that all objects, irrespective of their state, are separate. This seems close, but it's quite distorted. There are two levels of distortion here. First off, it says the world exists on the assumption. It is not an assumption. It is a belief, as we see here. Second off, why are we talking about the world? It is the author's assumption. It is true in this particular context in regards to the basis of the problem of knowledge, but then the world cannot be qualified. There's no such reference in the passage. The third problem is that all objects, irrespective of their state, are separate. And irrespective of their state, there is a massive generalization which the passage doesn't support. It says the existence of a substantial object. So it is only substantial objects which need to be separate, also as opposed to a quality or attribute. Now, if this said the existence of objects as opposed to qualities or attributes, we would separate or distinguish qualities and attributes from objects. But the existence of a substantial object as opposed to a quality or attribute, that leaves it ambiguous. We cannot be certain whether qualities and attributes, they are objects or they are not. So all objects, irrespective of their state, are separate. That is not supported by the passage, not necessarily. So we can eliminate A. Option B says the existence of subjects is dependent on the epistemological evidence that they are all separate. This is also incorrect. We've already seen the separate nature, the separability of substance, that all substantial objects, they are separate from other objects. They can go about their own isolated existential fate. This has nothing to do with the epistemological view or epistemological evidence. We see the belief mentioned here, the belief coming from the ontological belief of the question of existence. We see the direct connection in the last statement of the first paragraph. Be that as it may, such a belief, referring to the ontological belief as mentioned here, seems to me to underlie, actually, or potentially as a Socratic presupposition, many common sense and philosophically sophisticated views about the world, and I will take it to stand as the fundamental common principle of all forms of ontological realism. The belief may be formalized into. So the separability of substance, it is a formalized version, a principium based on the belief of ontological realism, not epistemology. Epistemology doesn't connect here. We see from the first statement that the requirements of ontology and epistemology pull in different directions. So this does not connect with epistemology at all. B is incorrect. Option C tells us existence of substantial objects is isolated, separated from other objects. This is quite true. The separability of substance, what does that mean? The existence of a substantial object, as mentioned here, is separated from other objects, means that it can be separated from other objects to go on its own isolated existential fate. This is almost a direct reference. We can easily qualify this. Option C is a valid choice. Option D says all objects can be separated from their attributes and then they go on to have their own existential fate. We have something in common with option A, but there are otherwise 2 or 3 problems with this option. It says all objects, the same as option A, all objects irrespective of their state. It doesn't say irrespective of their state, but the same generalization exists because we are only talking about substantial objects, and we cannot be sure whether qualities or attributes can be called objects or not. First off. Second, we have a major distortion in can be separated from their attributes. We have substantial objects separate from each other, separate from other objects. We don't have them separate from or isolated from attributes as opposed to qualities or attributes. That's not what this means, can be separated from their attributes. And then they go on to have their own existential fate. They will continue to exist nonetheless. They will go on about their own isolated existential fate. It doesn't depend on being separated from attributes. So because the mention of attributes is incorrect and distorted, the conclusion from that, and then they go on to have their own existential fate, that is also distorted. So D can definitely be eliminated. The correct answer is option C.